Hello and welcome. My name is David Callahan, here with the Prince Mohammad bin Fahd Program, Center for Strategic Research and Studies here at UCF. I am joined with Mr. Kerry Cammack. Kerry Cammack is a fellow at the Middle East Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where he focuses on long-term regional trends and their implications for American foreign policy. Thanks for coming out, Kerry.
Thank you, David. It's a real pleasure to be here.
So, let's just start with, what does the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace do and kind of what are its goals?
Well, in a few words, the Carnegie Endowment was started in 1910 by Andrew Carnegie, of course, a Scottish immigrant to the United States who became extraordinarily wealthy. He was internationally focused, and I think it's interesting to think about the time the Carnegie Endowment was started in 1910. In some ways, there's some similarities to the situation we're in now, in which, of course, no one could have predicted World War I, but I think there were winds in the air. He felt real unease at the direction of international politics, set up the Carnegie Endowment to kind of look at ways that conflict and the possibility of conflict can be reduced. I guess you could say we're 100 plus years into this. We haven't been very successful. On the other hand, as I mentioned, I think in some ways an institution like Carnegie, given the disorder that's kind of permeating the international system, is I would argue kind of as relevant or more relevant now than it's been, at least in our lifetimes. So now Carnegie started with one institution in Washington. Now we really are a global institution. We have 6 centers, Washington plus centers in Beijing, in New Delhi, in Beirut, in the Middle East, also Brussels and Moscow. So it gives us kind of a global perspective on issues of international politics, diplomacy, but also conflict resolution, etc.
With your program specifically, what are some topical or country focuses that you have?
Yeah, I mean, of course, we're quite focused on, the kind of big events of the day. Certainly, as we're speaking today, Syria is certainly a hot topic, which I imagine we may get into. Certainly Iran and the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the Iran deal, and kind of whether the Iran agreement is something we're looking at. I would say in terms of our own comparative strength as a program, we're not necessarily military experts per se. I would say our real value added is to try to look not just at the outcomes of conflicts, but to try to get at some of the deeper drivers of conflict and instability. And by that I mean, and we can talk about this later on, but kind of, for instance, catastrophic collapse of governance and accountability and the rise of authoritarianism in the Middle East, and the way that that's kind of given rise or created the context, say, for the Islamic State to emerge in the first place over the arc of, say, the last 10 or 15 years. So we're kind of very interested in internal dynamics in countries. We're also very interested in how kind of changing social contracts, the pressures of globalization, how these give rise to grievances and create kind of crisis of confidence in institutions, which then can kind of trigger, what we've seen over the last several years, which has really been a quite chaotic Middle East, of course.
You mentioned the underlying causes. What are some of the main underlying causes between the rise of the Islamic State?
Well, we could spend a long time talking about that. I mean, I tend to think of, and obviously there's no, it's hard to give a kind of scientific answer to this. A lot of this is interpretation, but it seems to me that you can't talk about the Islamic State without looking at both strategic factors and local factors. And by strategic factors, I would argue that it's indisputably the case that the Islamic State would not have emerged absent the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 and the kind of domino, the cascade the dissolution of the Iraqi army, the kind of turbulence that followed the Iraq Civil War from 2003 to, say, 2007, 2009. And then, so that's the first part of it, these kind of big tectonic plates of kind of geopolitical events. But then the flip side of that, I think, and I alluded to this a little bit earlier, are the kind of institutional collapses going back decades in places like Syria and Iraq. The fact that you had, authoritarian, totalitarian states, highly corrupt, with kind of diminishing economies, high level of repression, that created these grievances that basically allowed, in some ways, I like to say that some of the pressures that we're seeing in Syria and Iraq are pressures we're seeing in Europe, we're seeing them in the United States, we're seeing them globally. And the fact of, there are massive forces, economic forces, political forces, technological forces in particular, which are changing economies around the world. Now, in a country of strong institutions, of democratic institutions, of prosperity like the United States, that leads to one set of outcomes. Things are pretty turbulent here, but we're not in the midst of a sectarian civil war. But in a highly repressive state like like Syria, which has essentially been run as a mafia state by the Assad family for since the going on 5 or 6 decades, that leads to with deep sectarian cleavages and so forth. That leads to an entirely different set of outcomes, which in this case, unfortunately, was the Islamic State.
So now that the Islamic State has quote unquote fallen due to the loss of Mosul and Raqqa, what do you think will happen with both the power vacuum and with ISIS in terms of its organization?
Well, that's the big question. I mean, in some ways, I think what we saw with the Islamic State was really a catastrophically bad strategy on their part. I mean, the idea to create a caliphate. I mean, the Al-Qaeda model, if you kind of compare Al-Qaeda with, say, the Islamic State, the Al-Qaeda model was always to kind of operate outside of the state structure, which actually gave it resiliency. It limited Al-Qaeda's ability to kind of grow as an institution capable of governing as a state, if you will. But it also protected it in the sense that it gave it kind of resiliency and the ability to adapt to circumstances. With the Islamic State, I actually think from the IS's own perspective, it made a catastrophic mistake in trying to basically declare war against the entire world and declare a state and basically invite the military intervention which came. So phase one, or this is depending on how you want to call it. I mean, maybe you could call ISIS as kind of Al-Qaeda version 2.0. It really, I think, what we'll see or likely to see is kind of going back to the Al-Qaeda model, which means that the Islamic State, the caliphate itself, has been militarily defeated, but the institution has not. And so the question is, can it adapt to a post-caliphate phase in which it is about networks, it's online, it's a kind of ideology, or in the aftermath of the collapse of the state, does it just begin to kind of slowly dissipate and unravel over time? That's not really clear what is going to emerge, but I would say the challenge of terrorism emanating from Iraq and Syria certainly isn't going away. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if we see kind of Al-Qaeda, the kind of 1.0 kind of reemerge in the aftermath. But whatever the configuration looks like, whatever the leadership is, whatever the composition is, and I go back to where I started, until we begin, or the Syrians and the Iraqis are a little bit further along than the Syrians are, to kind of take on some of these political governance questions which allowed these organizations to spread in the first place. I'm afraid that this part of the world is going to remain very deeply, deeply troubled and unstable for the foreseeable future. So the kind of military phase, or the initial kind of intervention phase, clearly is winding down. Now we're moving into more probably a CT phase, and then the political phase. And the political phase, unfortunately, is the most complicated of all, and it's very difficult to see, particularly in Syria, how you put the pieces back together at this late stage.
A kind of regional / at least at this point, international issue is the return of ISIS fighters. Now that the ground organization, the military part's over, these fighters are kind of returning to their home countries. How are countries within the region working with that? Yeah,
it's a challenge. I will say, as someone prior to joining Carnegie, I worked at the State Department for a number of years in government. I do think a lot of progress has been made in the sense of there are kind of norms and mechanisms for the sharing of information, both kind of law enforcement type information as well as more highly classified kind of intelligence information between not just the coalition partners, but kind of institutions around the region and the world. So I think that helps to mitigate the challenge of the returning fighters. To me, what's interesting actually, when we look at these lone wolf attacks, some in the U.S., many more in Europe, also in places, like Libya or Tunisia, to this point, less of them are kind of returning fighters and more of them are kind of radicalized individuals, which is not necessarily what I would have expected if you had asked me this question 2 years ago and you told me, there'd be these attacks in Paris, here in Orlando, elsewhere. I would have thought, well, these are probably returnees. And in many cases, we're seeing, no, they're not. They're actually kind of self-identified ISIS members, but really also self-radicalizers in many cases, not in all the cases. So I think we also need to be careful about kind of drawing, kind of clear lines from where we've been to where we're going, because the space is likely to evolve in kind of very unpredictable ways.
Kind of shifting gears towards the Syrian civil war, recently there was reports of another chemical attack sort of similar to the one that happened same time last year. What do you feel like Washington's approach to this issue is going to be?
Well, I suspect by the time the listeners of this podcast are hearing this, they'll have a lot more information about what's happening than I do at this point. I mean, it appears likely that the Trump administration is heading towards some kind of military strike, although that's certainly not a certainty. You know, in my mind, the fundamental question is to what end and to what strategy, and how do you back that up? I mean, there's legal questions in terms of authorization for the use of military force, and constitutional questions in terms of the role in Congress and so forth. Putting those aside, I think what we saw from I guess you're right. It was almost exactly a year ago that there was the kind of targeted U.S. strikes against Syrian air base. I think we saw that there might have been a kind of short-term impact in creating some deterrence against the Assad regime, but that was rather fleeting, if not backed by a kind of broader strategy. I mean, it seems very clear to me that, certainly there may be a military component of this. There will be a military component of this, one way or the other, whether or not the U.S. is involved or not in the midst of a civil war. But absent some kind of international diplomatic effort, I don't think that the internal parties involved are capable of having any resolution absent a kind of outright Assad victory, which is a possibility, I suppose, at this point. But there needs to be an international component of this, and I think central to that is U.S.-Russia, but which, of course, given the atmosphere, is extraordinarily difficult. I mean, Russia's brazen kind of interference in U.S. elections, their interference in European elections, not to mention this, what appears to be an attempted assassination of a former Russian spy on British soil, which is, outrageous act. That's all true, and I think it's entirely appropriate that the West is kind of trying to respond to that pretty forcefully with sanctions against Russia. At the same time, though, I think it is important to keep some kind of space open for diplomatic channels, because I think the reality of the situation in Syria is, absent some kind of U.S.-Russia process, you're not going to be able to untangle the international components of it, whether it's Israel, Hezbollah, Turkey and the Kurds, Iran and the Saudis, U.S., Russia. I mean, this is a hornet's nest. And if you can't unpack that, then I think the conflict is likely to keep going indefinitely with the consequences we've seen and the chaos we've seen for many years. Now, how you create such a U.S.-Russia process in the current atmosphere, given the kind of political turmoil that's happening in Washington, given the level of distrust and animosity between Washington and Moscow, that's going to be very, very hard. But I think absent that, I won't say it's a necessary. I won't say. I mean, it's a necessary ingredient to it. It's not a sufficient ingredient, but it's certainly a necessary ingredient to begin to kind of unwind this thing.
You mentioned the kind of U.S. strategy of to what end, the sort of failure of an end goal, and that could be mirrored especially with the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Does that sort of hinder countries within the region to kind of ask for the U.S. for international help, since the U.S. can kind of come in with no real game plan and potentially worsen things?
Well, I mean, this is another big question. We could spend a lot of time talking about it, but I do think part of the instability, the structural kind of geopolitical instability we're seeing in the Middle East, is a reaction to the kind of U.S. recalibrating its traditional security role in the Middle East and different players adapting to that, whether it's Russia moving in Syria, whether it's the Saudis feeling that they need to play a more forceful role vis-a-vis Iran, whether it's Iran itself and its actions in Iraq and Syria and arguably Yemen, etc. I do think we're in this strange and pretty dangerous period in which the kind of regional roles, both of international players but also of local actors, are kind of undefined. And we've got new sets of actors, in some cases inexperienced leaders who are testing boundaries, and in so doing, in many cases, kind of exacerbate, all of these conflicts that we could talk about, whether it's Syria, Iraq is slightly different because of the U.S. legacy there, but Syria or Yemen or Libya, they all started, I think, notably, as I mentioned, kind of as local, essentially self-contained local conflicts. I mean, again, many of them having to do with authoritarian structures and corruption and so forth. But what's interesting is they have now all become internationalized and regionalized to varying degrees. so the U.S., frankly, the role of any of these parties in this Middle East is kind of undefined, and I would say probably no actor more so than the United States. And we can, if you want, I mean, we can talk a little bit more about why that is. But I think clearly we're in a very turbulent, uncertain time in the Middle East, and unfortunately, I think because of these structural instabilities, that is likely to kind of go on for some time.
You kind of mentioned regional actors, and one of those, you could argue, it would be Iran.
Yeah.
Recently, Iran had various Western or liberalized protests towards the government, towards this authoritarian regime. Do you feel like that will continue to grow in strength?
You know, I hesitate to make any predictions about what's going to happen in internally Iran. You know, I think one reminder there is Iran, like many of these countries, is not monolithic, and I think the Iranian public is pretty sophisticated in a lot of ways. There's lots of different constituencies. I think in certain quarters there's quite a bit of unease. I mean, you could argue that Iran is actually one of a more secular society than some others, at least in the Middle East, ruled by a kind of theocratic government. So that creates this kind of disconnect or tension there. I would take partial exception to your question, though, insofar as I think what was actually interesting about these protests was it wasn't necessarily the green movement people. So the protests, the real, I would say much larger uprising we saw in 2009 really was coming from the wealthy Tehran kind of suburbs, which are very kind of pro-Western in orientation, quite secular. What's interesting, I think, about these protests is many of them were actually coming from the regime's kind of much more conservative rural base. And I think that's what kind of caught the regime off guard, or the ruling class off guard, is these were people, many of them, not to kind of oversimplify things, but many of the protesters represented constituencies which I think the government felt they had on side. And so whether that actually is a sign that there's deeper discontent in Iran that has implications going forward, I think is a pretty interesting question. In fact, one of the points of contention was why are you, the government, spending all this money in Syria when we've got our own kind of economic grievances here, which is interesting because in some ways that represents the U.S. reaction, public reaction to this kind of succession of wars that the U.S. has fought. So, maybe there's some universal political truths in there, but whether or not that actually coalesces into to kind of something that turns out to be a more lasting threat to the ruling order in Iran, I'm not sure. And in fact, I think one thing about Iran we've seen is that it's quite adaptable, and because it does, I agree with you that it isn't certainly an authoritarian regime, but it does have these democratic trappings, which gives it some tools and mechanisms to navigate discontent in a way which a much more authoritarian regime, totalitarian regime, like say Syria, lacks.
So you mentioned the parallel, especially with the U.S., in terms of rural conservative parts not liking foreign intervention, and the same could be said about Iran. Could these similarities, in fact, help relations on some level, at least in terms of a popular opinion towards?
Well, I don't necessarily want to kind of overstate these similarities because I think the contexts are very different. I am struck, though, that I personally have not traveled to Iran, so I don't want to speak categorically about it. But among people, either Iranian Americans or journalists, American journalists that go through, or European diplomats that are there, a frequent thing you will hear from real Iran experts who've spent a lot of time on the ground, say in Tehran, is that they're struck by actually that the Iranian people, particularly the kind of in urban areas, maybe in more conservative areas it's a little different, but that they're basically predisposed to be pro-Western, that they ultimately aspire to better relations to Europe, to better relations with the United States. Whether that's possible in this environment with, we're now, almost at 40 years since 1979, and the kind of, with some interesting stuff that happened during the late Obama administration aside, we've basically been in this mode of 40 years of pretty intense animosity. And basically, let's be honest, that the Khamenei, the supreme leader, part of the oxygen, I think, that he uses to keep his power in check is animus against the United States and the whole death to America, death to Israel. This is, clearly clearly there's an ideological element to it, but clearly this is instrumentalized politically as a way to kind of feed the beast, so to speak. And so that's where, if there are signs that his own constituency are starting to get tired of that shtick, in terms of wanting to focus more on bread and butter kind of economic issues, that's an interesting question. I don't think we have the answer to that, and that will play out over probably years and possibly decades.
With the recent Iran nuclear deal, has that sort of positively inclined Iran towards America, at least from the 40 years of animosity? Has that kind of slightly warmed up that America is treating them like a legitimate country, legitimate government, doing deals?
This is a complicated question, of course. I mean, I think that was certainly the hope of the Iran deal. I mean, look, let's first be clear. This was not a political deal. It was not a regional deal. It was a narrow non-proliferation agreement, and I would argue a pretty important non-proliferation agreement. I mean, there's been a lot of criticism of the agreement, but if you think about how chaotic the Middle East is now, and then add on top of that a nuclear arms race, in my mind, that really is a catastrophic situation. I mean, look at what's happening with North Korea. I mean, if we could get in North Korea something like we have in Iran, I think most people would take that deal in a second. So as a non-proliferation instrument, I think it's achieving its purpose. Having said that, I think clearly there was some hope that that would kind of create mechanisms for dialogue and diplomacy, which could possibly eventually open channels for discussions in other vectors or other issues. That hasn't happened. I mean, frankly, it didn't happen in the Obama administration, and it certainly is not happening now that President Trump has taken, his administration is taking a much more hawkish view. They believe, rightly or wrongly, that the United States paid too high a price for the Iran agreement, that it's not permanent, that there are flaws with it. We'll see where that ends up. We'll see if I personally am skeptical that it's possible to amend the agreement. I think actually the European countries might be amenable to kind of, some of the timeline issues, some of the ballistic missile issues, some of the inspection issues which the Trump administration has raised. But whether or not China and Russia would be open in this context to reopen the whole agreement, let alone Iran, I think is quite unlikely. So then the question is, does the Trump administration pull out? And if it does in fact pull out, what happens then? I don't think we're necessarily likely to kind of head back to a nuclear crisis immediately, at least. But I think that puts us in this, again, pretty dangerous game of potentially tit for tat. U.S. imposes sanctions. Iran kind of begins to turn on some centrifuges again. We kind of go back and forth, and then really we're right back where we were several years ago when we were trying to avert a nuclear kind of runoff. So it's very hard to see where this will go, but it does look like kind of U.S.-Iran animus is a pretty central feature. I mean, it's been, I would say consistently a feature, well, really of both Washington and Tehran, and we're kind of back on course again. Whether it's a collision course or not remains to be seen.
Kind of a pivot from Iran to Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
Recently, they have the new crown prince,
Yep.
Mohammed bin Salman, doing a lot of more, arguably, liberal moves, such as calling for a moderate Islam,
Yeah.
letting women drive. Do you feel like this is sort of the calling sign for a change in Saudi Arabia, or is it just going to be only with him and then next king, business as usual?
Well, there clearly are changes happening in Saudi Arabia, and many of them are clearly for the better. I was actually in Riyadh a couple weeks ago for the first time in maybe 4 or 5 years, and you see the changes are evident. I mean, you see women in government offices in a way you didn't 5 years ago. You see women on the street or in cafes. Still heavily segregated by sex, still very highly, very, very conservative. But the social changes are self-evident, and I think they're actually quite positive. I mean, something like 55 or 60% of, and this has been going on for many years, of Saudi college graduates are women, and that's not necessarily something that I think bin Salman is creating, but I think he's channeling it. These social changes are happening. I think he sees that as a vector for his own empowerment, and from my perspective, that's fine and that's great. The real question in my mind, and I do think he sees himself as a modernizer. I do think he sees Saudi Arabia as a country which has been kind of backward leaning and wants to make Saudi Arabia kind of engage with the world, and I think that's positive as well. The real question in my mind is what all these changes mean for the social contract, and I think you alluded exactly to this in your question. It's not a liberalizing one politically, and so can you modernize Saudi Arabia socially? Can you modernize Saudi Arabia economically? Can you begin to diversify its economy from oil, but still remain essentially a country that's named after a family, where with no, I don't even want to say democratic, but no kind of checks and balances and accountability in the system? That to me is the real question. And I think as you have women beginning to drive, you have, if you can begin to get a burgeoning middle class, if you begin to have kind of alternate economic sources, I think that will create political pressures. The question is, what happens when the kind of centralizing instinct, I think, of Mohammed bin Salman hits with the kind of economic opening? Where does that, what does that do to the social contract of the country? And in some ways, look, oil prices have sharply declined. It appears that the Saudis themselves have internalized this as a structural shift, at least for the next 3, 4, 5, 6 years. And essentially the message has been the old order where we paid for everything, we gave you a government job, we pay for your house, we pay for your education. That's no longer really in the cards. So if you are, say, a 25-year-old, newly graduated person trying to make his way in society, you know, are you going to demand, if you're being told you've got to do more, you've got to work harder, you've got, you know, you're going to get less benefits from the state, which, you know, may be necessary, may be good, but in return, we're not actually going to give you anything more in terms of your own political voice. How will that sit? And I think we don't know the answer to that question. Although I will say, the Saudis that I talked to, I do think that Mohammed bin Salman is enjoying a kind of groundswell of popularity. I think the general public, I think, is predisposed to want him to succeed. Many people I talked to said it's about time. We've been waiting for decades for kind of a young, dynamic leader who has a vision for change. So I do think that gives him a kind of basis to build on. But how long will that last? You know, is an open question.
So it's going to be sort of a big question. Do you feel that the current events that are going on, the current issues, are sort of culminations of trends that have been going on for 40, 60, maybe even 100 years since World War I?
It is a big question. Let me kind of end this where I began it, which is if you're looking at, you know, whether it's Syria, the conflicts, say in Syria or Yemen or Libya, you know, you can't really understand any of these situations unless you look both at the international aspects, so Saudi, Iran, U.S., Russia, Israel, Hezbollah, et cetera, which clearly are driving things. But we also have to understand the local dynamics. And I do actually think that what we're seeing is basically the collapse of an old social, economic, political order in at least the Arab states in the Middle East. You know, many have talked about what we could call an authoritarian bargain in many of these states that was created after during the creation of many of these states in, say, the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, whereby basically publics were told, with this authoritarian bargain, we'll provide you a job, we'll provide you education, we'll provide you cheap gas, but in return, basically keep your head down and don't ask too many questions. And that was sustainable for a time, in part because populations were smaller, oil prices were higher, and frankly, control of information was pretty absolute. And what we've seen in the last couple of decades is in each of those cases, this level of control has eroded. And basically, populations have exploded, and governments no longer have the ability to either co-opt or coerce their publics into this authoritarian bargain. So I think on the political, social side, we started to see things unravel in 2011. Clearly, the so-called Arab Springs in many cases went off the rails into a very bad space, but in terms of violence and sectarianism and the rest. But I think the impulse that gave rise to those frustrations are still there, and they're not going away. And then more recently, so that's, again, the political side of the formula. Then what we've seen in 2014 and after with the collapse of oil price is now the economic model is no longer viable for many of the rentier economic system. So I think what we're going to see, you know, in addition to these conflicts, which complicate any efforts to reform, I think there's a real struggle to define and articulate what is the state, what is the role of the state, and how do states function. And until there are well-articulated answers to these questions coming from the region, certainly not from the outside, we're likely to be in this turmoil for some time. Now, maybe I'll end, there are some glimmers of light. So, for example, in Tunisia, for all the problems they have, they've started to answer the political side, where they had a consultative process to create a new constitution, to create essentially a new social contract. And so for all the problems they have economically and politically, they have essentially created at least the possibility of a new political order in Tunisia, which, if that could be replicated elsewhere, would be a good news from the region. In a place like Dubai, we've seen a partial answer to the economic challenge, where there has been diversification, there has been a kind of focus on a kind of building some meritocratic institutions where hard work and entrepreneurial spirit is rewarded. So there are glimmers, but unfortunately, and again, I've said this earlier, I'm afraid that as long as these kind of catastrophic conflicts are kind of festering in Syria and in Yemen, beyond the kind of immediate humanitarian consequences of those will create a kind of deadweight loss or dead weight on kind of reform efforts elsewhere. So that's why, for my own, I talked about the need for some kind of for international serious process on Syria. Part of that is to create the space so that these reformers and visionaries who are trying to create kind of more accountable institutions have space to operate, because in the current Middle East, it's very difficult to kind of put forward a positive vision in the face of ISIS and so forth.
Kerry Cammack, thanks for coming out and talking.
Thank you.